European School of Oncology, e-session will start soon, please hold on. European School of Oncology, e-session will start at 6:15 p.m. Central European Time, please hold on. European School of Oncology, e-session will start soon, please hold on. European School of Oncology, e-session will start at 6:15 p.m. Central European Time, please hold on. School of Oncology, e-session will start soon. Please hold on. Good morning, afternoon and evening. This is the conference operator. The European School of Oncology welcomes you to the e-session 530,002. Today's session is the impact of COVID-19 on drug development and the future of clinical trials. As a reminder, during the live session, all participants can ask questions live at any time by simply pressing on the relevant button at the bottom of the page. Questions will be received by Professor Raimondo Melo, of the Federal University of São Paulo, Unifesp, São Paulo, Brazil, who will discuss them with Dr. Anastasios Stathis, of the Oncology Institute of Southern Switzerland, Bellinzona, Switzerland, with Dr. Norman Blay, of the CHUM, Hôpital Notre Dame, Montreal, Canada, and with Dr. Daniel Heng, of the Tom Baker Cancer Centre, Calgary, Canada. Here is an extract of the policy which is published on our website in full. I will now hand over to Dr. Blay. Doctor, your line is now open.
Good morning. Well, actually, good late day to you all in Europe. Here is the middle of the day in Montreal, and I'm going to talk today about the impact of COVID-19 on drug development and the future of clinical trials. Actually decided to share some of the experience we have encountered in Montreal during the So the objectives of my talk today is to discuss the ethical principles that guide adjustment of research during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm also going to describe the impact of COVID on research-related activities and describe particularly what happened in our site in Montreal, and challenges of maintaining research activities in our new world. Here are my disclosures. Some of you may have participated in a talk that was given during the ASCO virtual meeting by Dr. Ned Sharpless, the NCI director. And resume of the impact of COVID-19 on cancer care and research. And the most important points that he made was that we can expect delayed diagnosis and upstaging of tumors, considering the late pickup of some cancers and the delays in terms of getting access to treatment. Reduced or non-standard care, considering difficulties in access in radiation oncology, the surgical suite, the infusional chemotherapy suite. Obviously, this has some impact in terms of clinical trials and drug discovery activities. We can expect as well increased cost of clinical trials because of the bigger burden of activities. And the last but not the least, many basic cancer research activities have been stopped or slowed down due to COVID-19. So I'm the director of in Montreal. And the first thing that I went back to when thinking about what we'll need to do to adjust our clinical trials activities in March at the start of the big outbreak in Montreal, I went back to the NIH principles guiding clinical research and tried to focus a bit on how trying to handle what we will do in clinical research. And just to refresh your memory, social and clinical value is important when we do clinical research. Trials have to be scientifically valid. The subject selection has to be fair. The risk-benefit ratio for the patient has to be favorable. There needs to be independent review of our study. There needs to be informed consent. And there need to be respect for potential and enrolled subjects. So when we put this in the setting of COVID-19, if I can get my next slide. Many things can be affected by COVID-19. So if we take social and clinical value of the affected by COVID-19, but for some types of research, if the activity is slowed down too much, then it can end up changing the way we collect information and the way the treatments are given. So potentially a trial that is studying neoadjuvant chemotherapy and surgery can then the objectives of the trials become very difficult to address, and therefore the clinical value of the trial may be affected. Scientific validity of the trial goes in the same principle, but in the setting of an outbreak of COVID-19, if there is a lot of activities in the trial that are being collected, this would tend to favor the null hypothesis. So the expectations that the objectives will be met from the trial may be decreased. So that has to be kept in mind. Fair subject selection is important in the COVID-19 world. Obviously, we all know that some risk factors are affecting patients and the risk of infection, the risk of getting morbidities from this infection, such as older age, such as comorbidities like diabetes, heart disease, renal disease. So all things that have to be kept in mind when we're approaching patients that are potential study candidates. So the favorable risk-benefit ratio may change over time. So it's hard to decide if you recruit a patient today, if there's going to be, for instance, potential benefit of a clinical trial down the road in the coming months. Independent review still has to be done. Informed consent to the patient also needs to be done. And the informed consent is challenged in COVID-19, in a COVID-19 world, because we have to provide updated informed consent to our patient and talk about the risk of infection, that this infection may cause to the conduct of the clinical trial for that specific patient. When we think about respect of potential and enrolled subjects, that needs to as well bring many adjustments in the way we conduct the trials. In Montreal, the government, the local government, recruitment of our activities. So that was pretty much what happened in Quebec in March. There was a recommendation that we continue ongoing treatments, obviously, for the patients that were already included in trials. And there were exceptions that were proposed that we could consider enrollment if no alternative therapy could be provided for that particular patient. Felt that there was potential to derive an important clinical benefit, such as, for example, targeted therapy trial with known responders in a situation where the patient didn't have any other alternatives. And the study would have to have minimal impact on the resources of the cancer center. So we wouldn't want to accrue patients to add on more radiation treatments, more chemotherapy treatments. So the So essentially, as I've told you, after mid-March, the accrual of new patients stopped completely and has just been resumed in the past few weeks, where we're actually restarting to accrue patients in trials after a 2-month hiatus. The number of treatments have decreased by roughly 30%, as you can see on this graph. The most important change has been the way patients come to our cancer center for research visits. You see in blue on the right side of this panel, the number of visits in presence for patients have decreased from a maximum of 150 visits in February to roughly 50 visits in May. So to be seen in the clinic by essentially telephone appointments. That has increased a lot, as you can see in the gray part. This had also effect in the number of laboratory and radiological assessments of patients. You see that in March, everything was delayed by a few weeks, so that has activities that were needed for patients in clinical trials still were conducted, and you can see that there's the demand has been kept up in April and May for the patients that were already accrued in clinical trials. The small decrease is related to the number of patients that were not picked up for new So what is going to happen in the future? Well, I find this proposal very interesting, and it pretty much in the coming months. It's important to talk to to involve local healthcare providers that are going to potentially help us to participate in the care of patients that are under research. I think some other of my colleagues will talk about what can happen to oral new drugs that can be shipped directly to patients, talking about alternative procedures such as telemedicine with the future, and that's going to affect patients in clinical trials, as well as provide informed consent remotely instead of having patients come in at the cancer center. In this new publication in Nature, you can see that many different centers are doing just that, just changing the way they're conducting remote access to patients without having them come to the cancer center and providing the same research-related activities. So this can lead to the traditional way of seeing things where everything is conducted centrally at the research site and with research personnel. And the idea that is becoming more accepted now is that the where the location of the data collection will be remote and the method of data collection will be more virtual. So I think I've extended over my time. So I'd like to conclude by just pointing out that adjustments in clinical research activities are very center, regional, and country specific, and everything has to be done for the best interest COVID-19 pandemic or other major healthcare issues. COVID-19 continues to be a major logistical and financial challenge for the conduct of clinical trials, and that we have, in the past months, thought of many innovative strategies that will probably change the conduct of clinical trials in the future. So thank you for your attention.
Excellent. So I'm Daniel Heng, and I'm up next. And so I'm just going to see if we can move the slides forward here. Remember that you can ask questions at any time and send comments at any time. And we have a little view box there to see what's going on, so feel free to do so. And I'll give you my perspective of what's been happening with clinical trials. So I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So I'm another Canadian on here, same as Professor Blaise. And I'm the head of clinical trials here in Calgary, and the division head as well for medical oncology. So I think a lot has happened with COVID-19, and a lot of us have heard a lot about COVID-19 and how things have changed, and people have been affected differently in different centers. So a lot of things have stopped. You know, for example, when patients are here in hospital, no one's allowed to visit them. If you have an outpatient appointment, if someone's here for clinical trials, they're not allowed to come with anyone. So if you have someone who can't speak English, or someone who has dementia, or someone who can't get around, it's actually very, very difficult for them to be seen in the hospital or through clinical trials. And that's changed a lot. As of today, actually, we're allowing visitors because we've been able to flatten the curve, and our caseload is low, and now we only have about 6 people in the ICU in the entire province. And so things have gotten a lot better here in Alberta, but we have to remain on watch and be careful to make sure that the curve doesn't go up again. I'll talk about what's changed also and what we've learned, and we'll go through that. So I do a lot of registry work, a lot of database work. I'm the chair of the International MRCC Database Consortium for Kidney Cancer. And so, these sort of retrospective databases and registries are very near and dear to my heart. Thankfully, they haven't been affected much. And in fact, we've been able to do more research as some of us are working from home, coordinators are working from home, medical students, they have the rest of their year canceled, and so they're working from home as well and able to collect data. And so, so this is what we have here. And so at the IMDC, we've been able to collect things and collect COVID-related things as well. And one of our friends have really thwarted this a cohort study together and led it. And so this was published in the Lancet, looking at the CCC19 consortium. So this is a big effort with a lot of European involvement, and you can see a lot of European co-authors there. And it basically asked people around the world, investigators around the world, if you have a cancer patient and if they've been diagnosed with COVID-19, can you please share your experience? It's a de-identified REDCap database. Because it's retrospective, the patients aren't involved. It was IRB exempt. They got an IRB exemption, and they were able to publish this in the Lancet. And I think there aren't things here that you don't already know, but for example, age was associated with a higher risk of death. So the older you were, the higher risk of death you had. If you had a poor performance status, you had a higher risk of death. If you were in remission or had no evidence of disease, you were just like anyone else in terms of cancer risk of mortality. But if you had progressing disease or you're currently on treatment, your odds ratio for mortality is higher, upwards of 2 to 4 in terms of the odds ratio. So I think that's helpful to know and keep into context that our cancer patients are vulnerable. They're immunosuppressed, and even the ones that aren't immunosuppressed with chemotherapy, if they're on immunotherapy or if their cancer is progressing, they're at higher risk of death as well on infection. So that's why it is very important to protect these susceptible patients, prevent patient visits that are unnecessary, and really reduce the amount of time that people spend here or in the labs or in CT scans because they can all get exposures there. And I think that's going to really color the rest of my talk in terms of why we've instituted such policies. And thankfully, our sponsors of clinical trials have been very understanding. Interestingly, over here, this was just retrospective data, though. But if you had both azithromycin and hydroxychloroquine alone, your odds risk of death is high as well. So what did we do in Calgary? In terms of basic science research, drug development research in the lab, all of that had to stop. So it stopped for about 3 months. They're just starting to open things up starting next week. All COVID-related research was allowed to continue, though. And so in terms of basic science, a lot of things have stopped. And so we've been able to do a lot more registry work and a lot more real-world evidence work, but we haven't been able to do any basic science research during this time. All non-interventional studies requiring patient participation were also on hold. So if you had a PK study looking at drug levels, or if you had a quality of life study, all of those things were on hold because it exposes patients potentially unnecessarily. All registry, retrospective database work was done from home. And like I said, a lot of medical students were at home and a lot of coordinators were at home. And so a lot of data could be collected through remote access. In terms of clinical trials, though, in Alberta, we deemed clinical trials as an essential resource, as an essential service, because as we know, clinical trials can provide drugs like third-line therapy drugs, fourth-line therapy drugs that just aren't funded or just don't exist. And so we've been fortunate that we've deemed clinical trials as an essential service. There are some clinical trials that had to close because, not close, but were on hold by sponsor request. But for most other clinical trials, they remained open. Of course, as Professor Blaise said, we have to balance the risk of coming into the hospital with the benefit of doing the clinical trial. And so that conversation had to be entered in with all informed consent conversations. In fact, the Clinical Trials Group of Canada, CCTG, actually created a note to file to our REB stating that we will discuss all of these pros and cons of staying on a clinical trial in light of COVID, and discuss the pros and cons of signing on to a clinical trial in light of COVID. So most clinical trials remained at our center. Patients were seen in clinic. No visitors were allowed. A lot of patient clinics were done virtually, and these incurred COVID-related deviations that were approved by our REB and approved by our sponsors. And I think the sponsors have been really understanding of this unprecedented situation. We've never had this situation before where visitors could not come, and only essential visits had to be made at the hospital. So I think sponsors were really helpful and understanding. As long as we file REB deviations that said it was COVID related, we were fine. This means that maybe some lab tests were missing, maybe some quality of life forms were missing, maybe a CT scan was done 2 days out of window or so, or maybe they were done locally instead of in the hospital. But nevertheless, the data points are still there, and the sponsors really appreciated that. Most of our trial staff were sent home. Around mid-March, we asked all of our clinical research coordinators to go home. Not all of our clinical research coordinators had remote access, though, and so that's a learning for us that we should arm people with remote access as much as possible. Our clinical trials nurse still stayed in-house. We had forays into virtual monitoring. So as you can imagine, if you're doing clinical trials, you need to be monitored for safety. And so we did that virtually. Because visitors were not allowed into our institution, we did things like monitoring via Zoom or monitoring via WebEx, where the coordinator actually guides you through our own EMR. We did have some privacy concerns and confidentiality concerns of just letting our sponsors and monitors have access to our EMR from home, for example. So that's why we developed this method. We also had redacted documentations where our coordinators would send redacted documentation of lab visits, of hospital visits and clinic visits, and that seemed to work well as well. Privacy and confidentiality, of course, is of utmost importance, and so that must be upheld. And so we think about that every time we introduce new processes like this. We're also starting to introduce virtual consenting. So in Canada, there are some very strict guidelines about having to have wet ink signatures, original signatures. The investigator can't sign one copy and the patient sign another copy. It has to be the same copy, and it has to be photocopied and given to the patient afterwards, and has to be done in person. And so obviously with our virtual world now being so good, lawyers are accepting virtual signatures for mortgages and stuff like that. So I think for clinical trials, something similar can happen as well. And so that's what's happening here. We just need REB approval and sponsor approval, which we're getting. And of course, we're always trying to minimize contact. So now our pharmacy all of our trial drugs are being shipped to patient. And so this allows some flexibility in terms of our windows of when we can see the patients. And sometimes they're out of window, and so that we incur COVID-related deviations. Some of our trials are allowing standard of care labs instead of having to do lab kits here. All right. So I think what's going to happen after this? What's going to happen after COVID-19? And I think, unfortunately, this is going to last for quite some time. I don't see our restrictions on social and physical distancing relaxing too much over the next several months. So I think we're going to be in this mode for clinical trials for quite some time. We are seeing a small drop off in accruals, as similar to what Dr. Blaise has shown, but the essential clinical trials continue to run. I think even when we relax restrictions, I think we'll learn a lot from clinical trials and what we've done. So things like virtual consenting, maybe we should continue that, or things like virtual monitoring, maybe that can continue as well. Things like doing more standard of care lab tests as opposed to lab kits, doing CT scans at other centers as opposed to doing it in one place all the time. I think that sort of flexibility should be allowable after COVID. And I think it's up to our regulatory agencies and us to try to promote that as well. So I think a lot of change has happened. Virtual visits have happened, and we're learning a lot from it. And I think even clinically for us, we'll probably be doing more virtual visits after COVID-19, even though we don't have to do these virtual visits. We're just starting to allow visitors again now, but I think that these restrictions will still be in place for a while. So that's all I've got here in terms of slides. Happy to take any questions, and then the chat is available as well, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much for inviting me to this.
Okay, let's move on.
Hello to everyone. I'm Tassos Stathis. I'm a physician from Bellinzona, Switzerland, and I'm the head of the New Drugs Development Unit and chair of clinical research in my institute. So I think the two speakers that preceded me have very well presented the problem of COVID-19 and clinical trials. So I will now show you some of these questions. Some of them have been already discussed previously. So so the point is that so we need to have an idea of what are the problems for our cancer patients. And I think that one question that has been at some extent answered so far, and I think it does really guide also the problem related to clinical trials, is if cancer patients have first an increased risk of infections from SARS-CoV-2, if then they have an increased risk of complicated infections and of mortality. On the other hand, so this is something that relates to the patients. On the other hand, we know that where the infection has had an important high numbers, there has been an important pressure on hospitals. And there are several examples of oncology units that have been converted in COVID units. So this is also something that must be taken in consideration. So on which part of the globe we are referring to, and at which moment of the epidemic curve. All this can have, of course, an impact on anti-cancer treatments and, of course, on clinical trials. Now, these are some numbers that I think all of us are familiar with this kind of dashboards. This is the Johns Hopkins University dashboard, and this is a picture that was taken a couple of weeks ago. So you can see that there was 5 million cases of infection and 328,000 deaths that have been attributed to COVID-19. If per instance, just to have an idea of the numbers we are talking about, if we look, these are the estimates cancer deaths in US in 2019. And the 21st of May, there were in US 93,439 deaths. So there's no cancer apparently, that if you add the two, the number of cases in men and women, so this would be the second cause of death in comparison to cancer deaths. Of course, this is a very simple comparison, but I think it can give an idea that in 2 or 3 months now the numbers are more than 100,000. So we are probably the second. It comes second after cancer that you can add on men and women together. Now let's go to what we know about cancer patients and COVID-19. As I mentioned previously, the question first is if cancer patients have an increased risk of getting the infection and of going through more complications, and complications have been classically indicated as ending up with ventilation or ICU and death. So these are, I think, the major clinical complications. From this question, the other one is if we should continue treating our cancer patients as we are doing in everyday practice outside of COVID-19. So should we continue to do it also in the moments of high epidemics? Now, I think this was the very first paper on a very small number of patients from China. These are 18 patients that was showing some increased complications in the cancer patients in comparison to the non-cancer patients. I just wanted to mention here that pretty at the beginning of this pandemic, some comorbidities have been associated with a worse outcome of patients with SARS-CoV-2 infection, which was an older age, chronic pulmonary diseases, diabetes, and cardiac diseases. Now, this was the very first paper that was showing that cancer also can be another disease that can be added to this to the situations that can complicate the course of the COVID-19. As I said, this was a very small number of patients, but it seemed that there was a statistically significant worst outcome of the cancer patients, of the patients with cancer. Again, another, I think this was the second paper temporally that came up to Annals of Oncology, again from China, and again on a small number of patients that showed also that there was a worst outcome of cancer patients, and in particular of patients that are on some kind of anti-cancer treatment. So it seems that the patients that were getting an anti-cancer treatment, they were doing worse. Now other series came out also from Europe, from US. This is another paper published on bigger number of patients, and again showing that cancer patients seem to be more vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2 infection. This is another one paper with 218 patients where they also seem to be among the cancer patients some particularities of those that are even at higher risk, like hematological cancers and patients with lung cancer among the patients with solid tumors. This is again another series of 200 patients that was presented at the AACR meeting with thoracic cancer, and they showed that among these 200 patients, 70%, 76% of the patients were hospitalized, and there was approximately 35 of deaths that were attributed to COVID-19. So these first papers, but there are others coming out, seem to show that cancer can be associated with increased risk of complications. At this point, however, we must consider that many of these patients, of the cancer patients, do have also other comorbidities that belong to the comorbidities that I mentioned previously, and they represent, in any case, an increased risk of complications of a viral infection. However, from these papers, it seems that there is an increased risk for cancer patients. It could be that hematologic malignancies, transplanted patients, and those that one would expect that are the more immunocompromised patients, they could run into more complications. Lung cancer patients, but again, in lung cancer patients, I think that many of these patients have other comorbidities like chronic pulmonary diseases, but in any case, these are some of the indications that seem to be associated with an increased risk of complications. The other question that remains, I believe, open is if there is any particular kind of anti-cancer treatment that could be associated with an increased risk of complications. I think this remains as an open question. And as I mentioned before, I think that these are some of the policies that hospitals that were in the regions that were hit by the pandemic, they adopted. So what they did, they reduced the visits, and especially the follow-up visits. And I remember that in my hospital, it was the last week of February where we officially stopped the follow-up visits. So this was the first thing to do, the first thing that we did in our oncology patients, that we stopped follow-up visits. So these visits that were not visits for chemotherapy or for a possible relapse, but these were the standard every 3 or 6 or 1 year visits, they were put on hold. So this was the first measure that we took when we understood that there was a pressure that was coming in our hospital. The other thing was that we tried to also change some regimens. And I think this is also related to the first point. So what is the idea here? So the idea is that you try to have the patient less often coming in the hospital because you want to expose the patient to less visits. So reduce the risk of the patient getting the infection, the patient stay home. So this was the social distancing and staying home. So this was that all governments decided to do. And the other thing is that you avoid a pressure to the hospital. So you can use your resources, not seeing the follow-ups, but eventually getting care of the COVID-19 positive patients. So this is the follow-up, but also the treatment regimen. So another thing that we did was, when possible, to switch some IV anti-cancer treatment to oral, or to increase the interval between treatment cycles. An example is, an easy example, I think, can be the one of the anti-PD-1s, where there is, I believe, enough data in a situation like the coronavirus situation to go from an every 2 to every 4 schedule, or from an every 3 to every 6. So this has been studied pharmacologically. It seems that the anti-cancer effect is the same. So this was the second thing we did. All this to reduce the access of cancer patients to hospital, and those patients that you can do that because you still need to treat patients with cancer. And this, as I said before, is being done in order to reduce the risk of being exposed patients to SARS-CoV-2 and to reduce the pressure to hospitals. Now, from these main elements, I think it comes also every consequence with regards to clinical trials. So the situation on clinical trials during this time depends on the nature of disease under study. There are some types of cancer that would be treated, let's say, in any case, by the same way, even in a trial or outside the trial. So in that case, we can consider to include the patient in the trial. It depends on the trial design. It depends on the region where the study is being conducted and the moment of the pandemic. So I think it would be really impossible for us to think of doing a placebo-controlled trial a month ago, where the pandemic was really at the high levels, but it is now possible to do it now in my institute. And yes, as I said, the epidemic curve. So the decision on when to restart a treatment and when to restart with a trial depends on the epidemic curve. Now, there has been guidance for investigators and sponsors for from the major regulatory entities from around the world, and the main elements that have been correctly pointed out are safety of patients, and so this means that for each patient you must make a balance. You must weigh the risks of continuing a therapy into the trial and the risks of interrupting. So this is an evaluation that must be done for each single patient. The other thing is that there has been some guidance on how to continue follow-up of patients on the clinical trials. Many visits have been transformed to telemedicine, to phone call visits. In some instances, a lab was performed to close to home. I have an example of one patient on a phase 1 study that could not reach to our hospital, and we had to arrange together with the sponsor of sending the trial medication at the home of the patient. So this has, of course, resulted in several changes in the management of patients that are already included in the trial. So one point is the safety of the patients. The other point is the trial integrity. This is something that the investigators must consider and give the appropriate weight. The guidance here was entities to discuss with sponsor when needed with the ethics, new measures to undertake for the safety. What is very important is that deviations that of course can occur in this situation must be very well documented on the source document, and I believe that the PIs must be aware of when a deviation could have an impact on the primary endpoint of the study. And in that case, it must be discussed with the sponsor to find a way on how to manage these situations, considering always, of course, that the safety of the patient is the one to come first. Now, this was with regards to patients that are in clinical trials. So what happens with patients on new patients for clinical trials? So what happens in this situation is that there is one situation where the sponsor will say, we are going to put this trial on hold during this pandemic, and this will, of course, make easier the decision. You don't have to decide something because you just need to follow the direction of the sponsor. Now, when this does not happen, not all trials that are open in my institute had to close because of the decision of the sponsor. So in that case, it is, of course, the decision of the PI and the center to decide based on the benefit risk, again, for each single patient, if it does make sense to include a patient in a clinical trial. And this, of course, is also something that depends on the available resources. Including a patient in a clinical trial means that you need to see the patient usually more often than you would do outside of a clinical trial. It will probably require to do some more testing that might not be available in your hospital due to the general pressure of the COVID situation. And this, again, must be taken in consideration before proposing a study to a patient. Now the new trials have been on hold. We were not able to open new studies because during the high moment of the pandemic, the monitoring was suspended. It was not possible to perform site initiation visit on site, and there were limited resources eventually based on the hospital and the epidemic curve. Now, what could be the impact of all this situation on the research and the hopes for the future? Of course, the research on COVID-19 is important, and I think this has been mentioned before. Many labs that are oncology labs have to turn in COVID-19 labs. Some clinicians that are dedicated to the clinical care or to the research in cancer have also been somehow converted in COVID researchers. Of course, it is important that either the virus or a treatment can put the pandemic under control. But of course, we are researchers in the field of cancer, and we must make our best and make any effort to continue or restart the research on cancer as soon as possible and under safe conditions for our cancer patients. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for all the presentations. All the speakers were very nice, and also the topic raised so many questions. Unfortunately, our time it's past the time, but I will just have a space for one question. There is someone here that is question. So, what do you think regarding the results of the clinical trials? So we now are in the middle of a pandemic, and we know that clinical trials are recruiting patients in all parts of the world, many of trials. And do you think it could be considered a bias in the results of clinical trials? Let's talk in generally speaking, let's say, because when people designed the trials, they didn't knew that we would have a pandemic, and also a pandemic that can involve that can change the mortality in our population, because cancer patients it's a high risk population, either because they do chemo or other immunodepressive drugs, or also because of the age. So how do you see, one of you can just tell your thoughts, please?
Maybe
Ellie,
I can start.
Yeah.
This question to be asked. I think that's going to be another adaptation of the way we present studies in the future. Right. So when studies will be presented next year or in a few years, it's going to be important that the investigator and the sponsors make a divulgation of the number of missing treatments, number of missing and that's really going to affect the way we interpret the results of the study. We were very badly hit in Montreal, and even though we had difficulty in recruiting new patients, I would say that every patient that was on trial was able to get treatment on time, was able to get their scans on time. So I'm not worried in my particular jurisdiction, but maybe some parts of the world have been affected, and that's certainly cause for.
Yes. Well, sorry about the time. We are finished our time. We thank you we thank you all for your brilliant presentation and participation, and we hope to see you soon. So people can send questions through email, and then we can make a discussion or a forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Stathis, Dr. Blay, Dr. Heng, and thank you, Professor de Mello. Ladies and gentlemen, the session has now concluded. The next ESO session will take place on the 9th of June, at the same time. And Dr. Alessandra Curioni, of the University Hospital Zurich, Switzerland, Dr. Giulia Maria Stella, of the Policlinico San Matteo IRCCS Foundation, Pavia, Italy, and Dr. Andrea Riccardo Filippi, of the Policlinico San Matteo IRCCS Foundation, Pavia, Italy. We'll discuss with Dr. Berardino De Bari, of the Reso Ospitaliere Neuchâtel-Louise, Les Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland. The following topic: COVID-19 and oncological treatments, any impact on toxicities? Thank you for participating, and have a pleasant evening, day, or night. Goodbye.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time and have a nice evening or day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, it was a pleasure.
For me as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.